we'll back up a little bit, and we'll pick up at the bottom of Safdal Amud Bet. I just want to review two important points that came up in the last few days when I was gone and when it was Yantiv. One is, we started a new parak, and one of the important points of the new parak is it introduces this idea that you cannot catch fish or wild animals on Yantiv. And that leads to an important discussion in the Rishonim, which is, why not? If you can shecht animals, why can't you catch them? And that, again, leads to this question of, is it really true that you can do any malacha associated with preparation of food? So Rashi basically says that the only real problem is that you could have done it yesterday. You could have taken care of it from beforehand, which basically the Rishonim challenge. They say if it's something really related to food, direct food preparation, not indirect and preparatory, but direct food preparation, even if you could have taken care of it beforehand, you're allowed to do it on Yantiv. And anyway, it's not clear according to Rashi, would that make it biblically forbidden? Because in theory you could have done it beforehand, so the only things that you're biblically allowed to do are things that you had no choice but to do on Yantiv. Again, not no choice, but it wouldn't have been as good, like grinding spices wouldn't have been as good. Anyway, that's Rashi's approach. That basically gets rejected by the Rishonim. There's enough evidence against that. So what's the difference? So Tosfos quotes the Yerushalmi, the famous Yerushalmi connecting to Pesach, which we just left, that speaks about Ushmartim es hamatzos, that connects the idea of doing malacha juxtaposed to a pasuk about washing the matzos from becoming chametz. When do you have to wash the chametz from becoming chametz? When you add the flour to the water. So that the only malachas that are allowed are malachas that take place from the kneading, Nisha, K-E-N-E-A-D-I-N-G, on. So obviously, now of course, how does that correspond to like meat? And what corresponds to the kneading of dough? But somehow trapping is too early in the process. The problem with that Yerushalmi is that there are malachas that are allowed. We've seen in the Gemara, we've seen the discussion of borer under certain circumstances when it's immediately in the context of eating, grinding spices, all these things that normally are in the malacha category before you get to the kneading of the dough. It's by the processing of the flour. So that leads to a reconceptualization of what this idea is of milisha ve'elech. And basically the way the Ramban says it, and again it sounds very clearly like he's talking at a d'oraisa at a biblical level, and this is a point I made before, is that it's a distinction between, remember I mentioned to you once before that the Ramban says there are two psukim that allow food preparation on Yantiv. One is achasher yaseh l'chol nefesh, things that are done for the sake of food, and the other is achasher yeyachel l'chol nefesh, yachel, right? Yachel, achasher yeyachel l'chol nefesh. Yachel? Anyway, and the other is that when it doesn't say that explicit allowance of Ye'achel l'chol nefesh, it says melechet avodah, as opposed to by Shabbos where it categorically prohibits melacha. So the Ramban here focuses on the word melechet avodah, and he speaks about work that is done out in the field, liyamim harbei, for for many, many days, like sort of a major processing, as opposed to work that is done like in the home for immediate eating of the food. And that it's not a categorical list of avodot. You can have certain avodot, like grinding, which if what you're doing is grinding your wheat and turning it into a flour, that's melechet avodah. If what you do is grinding your spices, that freshly ground pepper or freshly ground spices, that's not melechet avodah. That's like a type of a home-based, kitchen-based type of a thing that you do. And really it doesn't become a categorical list of melachot, but it's a difference between the types of things you do in the context of your home to prepare food and things you do out before getting to the store, out in the field, large-scale, long-term type of a thing. And therefore he says catching animals, is that prior type of malacha. It's not the stuff you do in the immediate context of the making of the food.
People eat fresh meat or something?
Well, yeah, but they don't go out and hunt that. There are hunters, but it's not the classic type of, the Ramban says also you wouldn't do it because, again, if you're living as a caveman and you're a hunter-gatherer, you have no choice. But if you're trying to live a domesticated life, you want to have the meat hunted from days before so you can, plan for it. So you don't have to risk whether you're going to catch the meat.
So what about the fish? You can't,
Believe me, my fishing abilities, I would not go out and fish and assuming that's what I'm going to rely on for food that night.
It's strange to see these big varim seem to be contained ponds, right. So there's no fear that you're not going to catch?
Not so clear. It depends on if they were so contained, then they wouldn't be different than the animal case. The fish case is not allowed because it's less caught than the animals which are already caught.
So they had it in
Anyway,
your fish
this
bowl,
is the
you did
basic. I'm not saying that you can't ask questions about this, but this is the basic distinction. Against which the Ran basically gives up, and he sort of buys into the Ramban's type of a distinction, but he doesn't feel that it can really work because he feels that if it were biblical, it would be a distinction between actual categories of melacha, not the contexts in which they took place, and therefore the Ran basically says it's all rabbinic. That biblically you could do all this stuff. Biblically you could go ahead and you could cack animals and harvest the wheat and grind the wheat, and it's all rabbinic, these distinctions. But mostly to be shown him think it is biblical, but try to find exactly what is the clear way of making the line. The Ramban's conceptualization is probably the best for where do we find that it's allowed and where do we find it's not allowed. And this is a point I made before. Things that are based on like the preparing of the home, going to the store and getting the stuff and preparing it to home. There's also a caring aspect as opposed to the stuff of like before it gets to the store, if it would. Okay, so that's one issue I just wanted to review. The other issue that now we're in the middle of, the other very important issue, is the question about malacha of a non-Jew, or if a non-Jew brings from chutz l'tchum, what is the story? Or if a non-Jew does malacha. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. So we're going to pick up with that right now. Okay, 5 lines from the bottom. So there's obviously a muktzah issue, if the stuff was mechubar from before Yantiv and it only got cut on Yantiv, or if it only got caught on Yantiv, it's a muktzah issue. But now we're going to get to beyond even muktzah concerns, and let's take a look 5 lines from the bottom. Amar Rav Papa, says Rav Papa, Hilchusa, the halacha is, Nochli shehivi doron li Yisrael b'yom tov. If a non-Jew brings a gift for a Jew on Yantiv, Im yesh be'osa hamin mimechubar asur. If that type of a thing is, normally like grows from the ground, is right now in a state of being harvested, so there's a chance that it was harvested today.
In your area?
In your area. We just got through with the whole discussion that Safek Muchan is Asur. So then it is forbidden because it's Muktzah. Okay, you have to assume that it was attached and it was harvested today, and therefore it's Muktzah. Erev Nami Asurin, and in the evening, now in the evening there's no Muktzah concerns, right? It's the evening after Yantiv. So there's no Muktzah. So nevertheless, it's still forbidden, Bichdei Sheyasu, in the amount of time it would normally take to get this done otherwise. Now, of course, how long do you measure that? Like, let's say the guy brings in, 100 bushels of apples. Is it how long it would take it to get done with a crew of 20 workers? Is it how long would it take it to get done if he was just the actual malacha of picking the apple? Or is it the amount of time it would take to bring the apples now back, to the city and where you are and where he's selling it? So that's an interesting question of measuring b'chdei sheyasu. But the point is, you cannot benefit from these apples until you wait past, after Yantiv, the amount of time it would take in order for them to be harvested. Now, why I'll get to in a minute, but let's just understand that's his first point. And that's obviously not a muktzah issue, because it's Motzei Yantiv.
Yeah, but the first and second day, what about that?
Well, we'll talk about that, but that's not even bracketing that. Now, let's assume that, apples are no longer on the trees. It's post the apple season, so this stuff wasn't picked today. It's not a muktzah issue. So what would the only be concern be? And it's Yantiv, it's not even a carrying issue. So the only issue would be that maybe he brought it from chutz l'tchum. Okay, so tocha tchum mutar. If he brought it from within the tchum, it's permissible. Again, what are you doing exactly in the case of safek is not clear, but let's assume that you can assume it's brought from within the tchum. It's okay. Chutz l'tchum, top of the tet chaf hamid aleph. If it was brought from outside of the tchum, then asur, it is forbidden. That you cannot benefit from it. How long? B'chdei sheyasu. But it's a similar type of an idea we're seeing, that even when muktzah is not an issue, if the non-Jew did some violation, in order to bring it to you, it remains forbidden. But if you brought it for one Jew, it's permissible for another Jew. So what we have here is, aside from any muktzah concerns, like it's Motzei Yantiv in the first case, or it wasn't even growing on the trees, there's still an idea that you cannot benefit from what a non-Jew did for you on Yantiv. And you have to wait, B'chdei sheyasu, and so on. Now, why not? So there are 2 approaches here. Rashi and then all the others. What Rashi does is he ties this in to what an idea we find in Shabbat, which is basically called being nene from the malacha of a non-Jew on Shabbos. So if a non-Jew lights a candle for you, besides that there's a prohibition, I can't say to him, please light that candle, okay? I mean, we're not going to talk about like how you use, how you ask like the maintenance people in a synagogue, because that has to do with Sarchei Rabbim and with indirection and hinting and so on. But in a simple case, I can't tell to a non-Jew, please light that candle for me. Please cook this food for me on Shabbat. And if the non-Jew did it even without being asked, even if he just went there and he cooked it, but he cooked it for you, not for him. Not like he cooked it for him and it was left over. He lit a candle for him and there's light in it. No, he did it because he said, I wanted to cook you this nice dish for you here on Shabbos. Here it is. The halacha is you're not allowed to benefit from it. That's a concept of being nene from meleches nachri, deriving benefit from the malacha that a non-Jew did for a Jew on Shabbat. So that is the category that Rashi uses here to explain what is going on. And he says it's the same, therefore, if he does malacha for you on Yantiv. And that's why it's asurim even now. Why is it asur after Yantiv? Okay? Normally, if a non-Jew lights a candle for me, does something for me, I can benefit from it after Shabbat. So Rashi says, no. Maybe as long as you are deriving benefit from it, meaning as long as you are eating the food or using the candle or eating the apples that were picked within the amount of time, and there hasn't been enough time to do it after Shabbat, then you're still deriving benefit, right? If it takes an hour to get it done, and I wait after Shabbat an hour, and then I eat the fish or I eat the apple, then I didn't really get benefit from the Shabbos violation. Because even had there not been a Shabbos violation, I could be eating it now. But if I ate it within the hour after Shabbat, I derived benefit from the Shabbos violation because that allowed me to eat it immediately rather than to have to wait the time it would have taken. So for Rashi, the reason you have to wait b'chdei sheyasu is so that it should not be a way of deriving benefit from Shabbos violation, which it will be in that time that it would normally have taken it to be done, because then you benefited from the fact that it was done on Shabbat. That's how Rashi says, that's how Rashi says what's going on here. That's the problem, deriving benefit. What?
The food is okay.
No, on Shabbat it's obviously not okay, but it's even not okay after Shabbat. And the same is true on Yantiv as well in the period of Bichdei Sheyasu. Now, why therefore does Rashi say that therefore if it comes, if it's now Abba Bishvil Yisrael Zeh Mutar Yisrael Acher, normally we say that if a non-Jew, if I cooks a fish for you or picks an apple for you on Shabbat, no other Jew can use it. It was a malacha done for a Jew on Shabbat. No Jew can derive benefit. So Rashi says, well, okay, maybe that's in this special case of tchum. When the only problem was tchum and it's only a rabbinic problem, then we were lenient and allowed another Jew to derive benefit. This is more sharply said by Ramban. And Ramban says, and this is a whole fascinating issue about how do you define what it means to benefiting from malacha on Shabbat. Let's say the malacha didn't produce anything. Didn't create anything new. Now, what malacha doesn't create anything new? So, the biggest malacha that doesn't create anything new is carrying. If a non-Jew carries from me on Shabbat, can I derive benefit? Or do you say that, you either say, no, you did a malacha, you're deriving benefit. You say, no, because the idea of not deriving benefit is that the Shabbos violation created this new reality, and I can't benefit from this new reality. Carrying is not a new reality. It's not cooked food. It's just here rather than there. Okay, so, well, it's new for you. That's true. Well, it's accessible to you. So there actually is a debate about whether this idea of nene from Melechet Shabbat applies to carrying. But this case of tchum is even weaker than carrying. Because tchum is basically like other people did have access to it, and it could actually be carried. It's just a question of like where you're located and where it's located. And other Jews even had access to it. So the Ramban says maybe that's why we go a little bit more lenient here and we let another Jew get benefit, especially because other Jews could have been within their tchum, hypothetically. So anyway, that's a special exception to this idea of tchum. But the basic point is you cannot derive benefit from Melechet Shabbat or Meleches Yantiv. Even another Jew cannot. And there's this one exception of this issue of tchum. But the basic point that Rashi says is this is the principle of Melechet Shabbat being nene. 1 minute. That's Rashi. Tosfos and Ramban and all the other Rishonim and Lehalacha reject that opinion. Say, yes, that is a concern, but that's not what's going on here, because that, we never find that Melechet Shabbat is asur after Shabbat. And if it went ahead, basically, if
If I cook us,
if a Jew, let's say, cooks an apple for another Jew, so he, or whatever, a Jew just cooks an apple on Shabbat or picks an apple on Shabbat, that apple, for him, it might be also for forever, whatever. But for other people, for the non-violator, not the person who wasn't, the non-violator, it's permissible immediately after Shabbat. And they say this idea of bichdei sheyasu does not apply by normal melechet Shabbat. It applies specifically by melacha done by a non-Jew. Why does it apply specifically by malacha done by a non-Jew? Because malacha done by a non-Jew is not just a problem that it was a Shabbos violation that created the fact that this thing now is, I'm benefiting from a violation. If it was done by a non-Jew, there's another concern. The concern is that I'll start. It'll lead me to proactively ask him to do it. Okay, if you let me benefit from food cooked on Shabbat by a Jew a minute after Shabbat is over, it would never in a million years. I mean, sadly today it's different because there's a lot of people that that don't operate within a context of any sense of halacha and so on. So we'll just get this guy. He doesn't keep halacha anyway. We'll get him to do it. I mean, that's a big problem. Like actually, some poskim say that when it comes to doctors in the hospital, the dafka should not ask their non-observant Jewish doctor to take their shift on Shabbos because he doesn't keep Shabbos anyway. No, Adarabah. If you're taking the shift, you'll be more careful to only do the things you're allowed to do on Shabbos, as opposed to if you give it to some. So anyway, that raises an interesting issue. But at least in the time of the Gemara, the assumption was that it would never occur to me just because you're letting me eat this picked apple a minute after Shabbos that's going to lead next Shabbos for me to ask my fellow Jew who happened accidentally to pick it today. That'll lead me next Shabbos to proactively ask them. Never in a million years. But if you let me benefit from the apples that a non-Jew picked, and you let me benefit from them immediately after Shabbat, you know what I'm going to do next Shabbat? I'm going to make an arrangement for him to pick them on Shabbat so that I'll have those apples immediately Motzei Shabbat. Like I have people ask me, can we get a non-Jew, arrange for a non-Jew on the last day of Pesach to go out to Dunkin' Donuts and buy us all of these bagels and donuts, and that will be ready for us at Ma'ariv on Motzei Pesach, that we'll be able to eat from it right away. So that gets to issues of owning chametz and whose chametz is it. But that's a thing you'd want to do. Have them do it on Yantiv, have them do it on Shabbat, so it's available immediately after. So they say because it's a non-Jew, it actually makes it worse. Because it's a non-Jew, not only does it have the Melechet Shabbos aspect, that would be on Shabbos itself, but that's why it goes and extends to after Shabbat, after Yantiv, b'chdei sheyasu. So according to the Tosfos and the Ramban and all the other Rishonim, b'chdei sheyasu is only a concern by the malacha of a non-Jew. Okay, and that's basically how they explain that what's going on here is unique to that aspect. Yeah.
So two questions. One they say is the mechubar asur or whatever. So, but can he be believed? Say I know it's mechubar.
Yeah. So that's not clear whether. I mean, look, we learned before the issue of safek. So safek muchan, it would be an asur, presumably based on what we said before. The other question is what about safek chutz l'tchum? But anyway, I'm not getting into that. That's the question. Yeah.
I think it also would depend on what it is. Let's say he was on his way back from Virginia and he stopped along somewhere else and he brought me something he can only find there. Right. I'm still even if I could say, okay, I wait 5 hours, wherever the drive is. But there's no way I'm going down there.
Right.
I'm still benefiting from the fact that he did it.
Right. That is true. Well, no, but you could have had him do it for you.
But he wouldn't, though. You know what I mean?
Because he wasn't on his way back.
Yeah.
I mean, there's only to a certain degree that we can quantify it. I'll just end by giving you one interesting nafkamina, by the way, in addition to the b'chdei sheyasu question, which is Rashi raised the question that Michael said. What about if it's a 2-day yantiv? Let's say he does melacha for me on day 1 of yantiv. Can I benefit from it on day 2 b'chdei sheyasu? So Rashi says yes, I can. Why? It's the whole type of the steak of the yoma. If yesterday was chol, he was allowed to do the apple picking. If yesterday was yantiv, then today is chol, and then hypothetically, he could have picked the apples for me in the last 2 hours since second day of Yontif began. So therefore, I can benefit it 2 hours into the second day of Yontif. So Tosfos said, yeah, Rashi, I mean, I'm paraphrasing a bit, that works only according to you because you think it's a conceptual issue of benefiting from Meleches Yantav. So for you, it's enough that hypothetically he could have picked it today if today was Chol. So therefore, you're no longer benefiting from the violation because hypothetically it could have been done either yesterday or today, depending on which one was Yantav and which one was Chol. But as far as me, I don't care about hypothetic. I care about practical. Is this going to lead you to get the non-Jew to ask the non-Jew to do something for you? And you know what the answer is?
Yeah.
Yes, sure. It will lead you. If you let me benefit from what he does on day one and eat from it on day two, then that's going to lead me next year to proactively have him do something for me on day one, so I can benefit from it on day two. So it's all very nice hypothetically, Sfeik of the Yoma, but in practice, B'chtei Sheyasu has to wait till after Yantav when you really would have had to wait to have done it if you were doing it yourself. Okay, so that's a very important debate about that issue of a non-Jew doing melacha for you, and we pass like Tosfos' interpretation of that issue.
Rabbi?
Okay, yes.
Yeah, in terms of Joseph's question, Joseph, were you asking about the woman who works for you?
Yes.
So if she cooks for herself, can Joseph eat that food from
What?
Joseph has a woman who works for him.
Yeah.
So if she's cooking a meal, so
if she does it for herself,
and then
yeah,
also for Joseph?
Yes, let's put aside the issue of Bishul Aklam, but this is all of it's done for a Jew. If the non-Jew does it for him or herself, then you can benefit from it. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. All right, so that was a little bit of catch-up. Now we're already behind. Amar Rav Rav Huna, Amar Rav. Hasocha amaz hamayim me'erev Yom Tov u'l'machar hikshtimu matzah badagim mutarim. So you closed up your what's it called? A channel of anyway. You're like the sluice gates. What is it? What are those things called? Yeah. Anyway, whatever it is, your irrigation canal. You closed it up, so no new water was getting in. It was a closed system, and you did an erev Yom Tov. And presumably, in there, it's anything that's in there is considered already caught. It's small enough. We had that discussion. So therefore, and the next day you woke up and you saw fish on Yantiv, they're permissible because they obviously were caught from Erev Yantiv and they were muchan. From the words of our rabbis, meaning Rav, we can learn of a rabbi. We can learn if a wild animal, a deer, basically made its nest, in a garden, like set up its little home, and the assumption here is also gave birth to a young or had very young children with it. It does not need to be pre-designated, meaning two things. Number one is the animal is considered already caught, because maybe it's a very young animal, it's maybe even, it doesn't even really walk around so much on its own, and because, again, it's sort of like, accessible, and you're thinking about it, it's considered to be muchan. So it's both not a problem with caught and muchan. Wait a minute, the Gemara is not done. Amar Rav Nachman, Nafu Chavrayim B'Rav Revasa. Our friends, our colleagues, meaning Rav Chizda, who spoke about our rabbis, our Rabbi Rav. So he says our friend Rav Chizda got himself into a debate of great ones, because meaning that's not so obvious, and we'll see in a minute that you can infer from the case of fish caught in a pond to wild animals that are nesting. Igad Amri, some say Amar Rabbi Bar Rav Huna, Rabbeinu Yomod. Some say that it was Rabbi Bar Rav Huna said. It wasn't Rav Chizda that said. It wasn't Rav Chizda that said. It was Rabbi Bar Rav Huna himself said. From the words of our rabbi, we learn. Chaya Shakin Apapardes Eina Tzricha Zimun. Okay, he was the one that said that inferred from this case of fish to the case of wild animals that nested. Amar Rav Nachman Nafa Bar Chavren Berav Rivasa. And then it was Rav Nachman who said, not our colleague, but the son of our colleague, because this was Rabbi Bar Rav Huna. So Rav Huna was their colleague. Anyway, he got himself mixed up into a debate. What's the debate? So either way, the question is you can't really infer from the fish to the wild animals. Hasam Loko Avid Maaseh. There, in the case with the wild animals, you didn't do anything. They just took up nesting on their own. So what's there to indicate that you're planning, even if they're considered already caught and they're not wild or whatever, and they don't need being caught, what makes them not muktzah? They just did it on their own. There's nothing that reflects the reality that you're planning on using them. It's just something that happened out in the wild. Hocha, even if the parties is your back, even if it's your garden in your backyard, there's nothing that designated it that you were planning on using.
It's like an egg.
Hacha ka'avi masa. Here you did something. You closed the sluice gates. You actually did something that caught the fish. Okay, v'loba. So now the Gemara says v'loba zimun. Now you go to. So first of all, I don't think that it's necessarily so clear. Hypothetically, you could distinguish. And now the Gemara is going to say it's not only hypothetical. I'm going to show you evidence that you need zimun. You need designation in this case of the wild animal. The hatanya we talk in Beitzah. So wild animal sort of took up lodging in a garden. You have to designate. You have to verbally say, I plan on using that baby deer tomorrow on Yom Tov. Okay? The tzipor drawer tzarich likshor b'chnafeha, and a tzipor drawer, which is like a now if that's an animal that you actually did designate from the day before, although drawer kratim drawer ba'aretz normally like wild bird, we saw tzipor drawer before anyway, but that would be a bird that you caught and designated from the day before. Nevertheless, you need to tie up its wings, not to do the act of zimun, but kedei shelo titchalef, so you don't get confused which is the bird you designated and which was the one you did not. Okay, bi'ima, and you shouldn't confuse it with its mother, because apparently Rashi says this is a species of bird that the young are almost the same size as the mother. So even though it's a little nest, and you say, oh, I know I'm going to use the chick, no, it'll be confused, and you have to tie up its wings. This actually is a testimony that goes all the way back to Shmai and Avtalia, the rabbis of Hillel and Shammai. So tiyufta. So Gemara says, all right, that's a contradiction. That shows you that in this case of the wild animal, when you didn't do an act, you need to lizamein. So now the Gemara says, mi baya zimun? So now the Gemara switches gears. 1 minute, is that really true? Do you really need zimun in this case of the wild animal? The Hatanya, we turn to Beitzah. I'm Reb Shimon Eliezer. It says Reb Shimon Eliezer, Modi Beit Shammai Beit Hillel al she's minam betoch hakan umatza lifnei hakan shasurim. You might remember that going back to the first parak, that the birds you designated inside of the nest, and then you found birds outside of the nest. They're forbidden because you have to be afraid these aren't the same ones that you designated. The Medvar Mamurim. When is this true? Biyone Shovach, Biyone Aliyah. This is true about birds of the coop. And birds of the loft, and birds that have taken up nest in like the little crevices in the wall. Aval, meaning normally birds that are normal wild birds. Okay, so those are ones that need zimun, and these might not be the ones that you are mizamein, because normally they're not understood to be ones that normally you're planning on using. Aval, avazim v'tarnagolim, if you're a farmer and you've got ducks and chicken, the Yone Hardisiot and Herodian pigeons, which are normal ones that were kept for breeding and ones that you would regularly use. Like if you're hungry, you'll just go out to your pigeon coop and check the pigeon for tonight. So in addition to those animals you normally draw on for your meals, also a wild animal, deer, let's say, that took up lodging in your garden, mutarin, that's permissible without any zimun. So here we see, so everything worked that made sense, things you normally use for eating as opposed to things that maybe even some things you're even raising but you don't normally use for eating, which do need zimun, which do not, but the wild animal that took up nesting is a contradiction. One Beitzah said, according to Shmai and Avtalia, it needs zimun, and this Beitzah says that wild animal does not need zimun. 1 minute. The ain't tzrichim zimun. The tzipor drawer tzricha likshor b'chnafeh kadei shelo titchalef b'ima. What we said before, this type of bird, the tzipor drawer, even if you were mizamin it, you need to bind up its wings so you don't confuse it with its mother. V'mekusharim v'minunaim, and things, by the way, that have bound up birds, and birds that have obviously been disturbed and moved, b'borot b'batimu b'shichin b'me'arot, whether you find them in wells and in houses or in other types of like No.
Bushes?
No. Shichin and me'orot is it goes with bor and shiach is a what do you call it? It's a type of a well. It's a well with a bor and shiach go together. And in caves, mutarim, they are permissible. Meaning ubi'ilanot asurim. But so all these things, even if you were mizamein them, they're permissible if they are in all these various locales, but they're forbidden if they're in trees. Why? Even though you were mizamein them. Shema yalavit lo, because how are you supposed to get access to them? And you'll say, oh, just pick it off of the branch. We don't let you pick it off of the branch because we're afraid you'll come to climb up and to pull off branches and to use the tree. So that's another point. In addition to being mizamein them, you can't get access to them if they're in trees. Now, if they are bound birds, or they've obviously somehow been moved, I don't know how you would see that, but somehow you see that they've been handled by people, and they're not yours, so all that was your birds, you don't, some of them that are, certain ones you don't need to be mizamein, others you need to be mizamein, but you need to sort of like tag, and then, and they have to be in certain places that you can have access to them. But if they're ones that have been tagged by other people, then then obviously, forget Yontiv. You can't anyway take them. Clearly there's somebody else's, and it's forbidden because of Gezel. Okay, that was, I don't know, pretty obvious, but it has to do with issues of Kinyonim, and anyway, not related to Yontiv. So anyway, we have our problem here about wild birds that took up nesting in a garden. Do they need Zimun or not? So Amar Rav Nachman lo kasha. Haba habi ima. No, it's not. The difference is the child or the mother. This deer took up nesting in your garden, so the baby deer that can't easily get away, that doesn't need Zimun. The mother deer that can run away, that needs Zimun. So the Gemara, because it's not going to be easy to catch it. So the Gemara says, Ima, the Zimun Sadila? I don't get it, says the Gemara. The mother, Zimun isn't enough. It's not just an idea of muktzah. Say the Mal Yusabaya, right? It's not in any cage. You would actually have to trap the mother. So there's always two issues. So we're assuming all these animals are already trapped, and the only question is Zimun. But the Gemara says, how is this wild deer in your garden already trapped? Maybe the baby is effectively trapped, but not the mother. So you can't say that the mother is the one that needs Zimun. The mother is usher completely.
But
you
the
can't
assumption
trap it.
was if it set up its nest in a domesticated area, it was up until that kasha being treated, I thought, as if it were trapped of its own, as it were.
No, because, that's what the Gemara is revealing, is that even if it's in a domesticated area, right? If you have a deer walking in your backyard, yes, but the assumption here, what the Gemara is revealing is that the mother deer is not going to wait around to be trapped just because she set up a nest.
But up until that kasha,
yes, you might have thought that. Right. This reveals that the key number per days only works for the child who cannot easily escape. That is correct. The Gemara did not make that clear until this point.
Okay.
I mean, Rashi did, but the Gemara did not. So, Ela Amar Rav Nachman Rav Yitzchak, fine. We're talking in both cases about the child. And in both cases, it's already considered trapped. It's not going to easily get away. So do you need Zimun or not? But here's the difference. The question is, where is this garden? Is it basically in your backyard? Or is the garden out in some, in your apple orchard somewhere out at the edges of the city? So again, now it's a question of effectively it's trapped. If you wanted to, you could capture it without any problem, but does it need Zimun? So if it's a baby deer in your backyard, it doesn't need any act. You can assume you're going to play up. It's great. You'll have some venison for Yontif, and you don't need any words, and you don't need anything. It's considered to be in your mind, presumably you know about it, that you would plan to use it. Whereas if it's not so local, then it would need Zimun. Yes.
So I guess what I was trying to understand from the beginning was when you say is okay for the fish, but how's that any different than the dagim and the bibarim? Like, is this
we have to assume that it's a smaller space than the bibarim.
So that's what it is. A bibarim, just a very big one.
Yep.
So this is like you put in your net, you're definitely going to get something.
Right. Yeah. Effectively. Yeah. I mean that you have
the fish can swim away.
Right.
Then let's say that. Right.
Yeah. Correct.
But Rabbi, why does it have to be the assumption it's the baby? Doesn't this last piece here say, listen, it was in a pardes, right? Depends. Is the pardes smuch ala ir?
No, but that would not affect the issue about what do you call it? About Sedem al Yusabaya.
It's effectively trapped, depending upon where it's set up.
I don't see how that could at all be relevant to that. And our basic issue is to explain the Zimun question. So being local addresses the issue of Zimun. It does not address the question about how much trapping it needs, right? Being local or not local.
It's a response to Sedem al Yusabaya.
Yeah, exactly. So, but Sedem al Yusabaya, so therefore you're right, we're not talking about the mother. The Gemara is shocked at the suggestion of the mother. So the basic answer is forget the mother. You're right, it's just a muktzah issue, it's just about the child. The fact that it says bidida and not, you notice the word haba habi'ima. It doesn't say ha bevlad habi'ima. Or ba means it's always been assuming the subject has been the child. For you, that was a chiddush, but the Gemara has been assuming that the subject has been the child. Okay, Next Mishnah. Behema misukenes lo yishkot elim king yeshahus biyom lechol mimena kazayis sleep. So here again we get to the issue of doing certain malachas on Yantiv that are allowed for tzorcha v'ochel nefesh, but in your mind you're also thinking about after Yantiv. So like shechting an animal because you want to eat just a little bit and the rest of the meat is going to be for after Yantiv, or filling up a whole pot and you're only going to eat a little bit, but you have the rest of it for after Yantiv. So here you have an animal that's about to drop dead out of old age. Now, it's not a treifa. If it was a treifa, shechting wouldn't help. It's about to drop dead out of old age. If you wait till after Yontav and it drops dead, it's a nevela, right? It did not have a kosher shechita. So you want to shecht it on Yontav, not so much because you need an extra hamburger on Yontav, but because you don't want to waste the entire animal. And if you shecht it on Yontav and you shecht it before it dies, it'll be kosher. So it says you cannot shecht it unless you have time, the amount of time to eat at least one roasted kizayis on Yantiv. So then in theory, we could say it was being done for the sake of Yantiv. Now it's interesting, it doesn't say you have to actually go ahead and roast that kizayis, and that has to be your intent is to eat, right? That was the whole thing. Like when we talked about filling up a whole pot of stew, even though, as long as you're doing a little bit for Yantiv, how much can it be like a trick? How much can it be, I'll take a little taste now, and that counts, even though most of it is for after Yantiv, and how much does it have to really be that you really do want to be eating from this stew right now? So the Mishnah here doesn't say that Elin Kain Yochal Mimenu Kizayis Li. It all says only as long as it theoretically you can eat a kizayis, that would be enough. Wait a minute. Rabbi Akiva Omer afilu kizayis chai mi beis tvichata. Even a raw kizayis of meat, in theory, you could eat raw meat. So even a raw kizayis of meat from the place it was shechted, you just grab from the neck area because that's already where it's flayed and it's easy to get access. So you just need a few seconds to grab a kizayis from the neck. Well, that's the issue about salting. If you don't, if the blood doesn't come out and go back in, it doesn't need salting. That's the same reason why roasting meat doesn't have to get all the blood out. Shchita, now, shachta b'sadeh lo yivenu b'motu b'motah, aval maybe bi'adoi varim evarim. If you did shecht this or any animal out in the field, you cannot bring it in on like these beams, like sort of those whole images of like, the spies bringing back the grapes. You can't bring it back on these like cross beams or whatever, these carrying beams, because that makes it feel like, like a weekday, like you're bringing a whole animal, slaughtered animal, from the market, to the marketplace or something. But you can bring like it in sections and bring back sections at a time, in your hands, even though it's more tircha, but it's less uvda dechol. Okay, Dov, you had a question?
What I didn't understand about this Mishnah ever was, it's a havamina that you can eat from a misukenet.
Yes.
I was told the assumption was that you're looking at a treifa, basically.
No, so that's what I said. That treifa is different than, it's okay, treifa is different than misukenet. Misukenet means that it might die out of old age or disease, but treifa specifically is that it has like a puncture. So you can have an animal that's about to die that is not a treifa. Okay, which is also the Gemara distinguishes between somebody who kills a person who's a treifa and somebody who kills a and somebody and a person who's a goses. A goses is a person who's about to die, but he's not in the category of a treifa. Okay, so Amarami bar Abba. So that when the Torah speaks about bringing a korban ola, it says yifshit et hola v'nitachota l'nitacheha. So so you should flay it and cut it into its members, and put it sort of and chop it into its parts. So the Torah says it by an ola, but the same is true about butchers. That after you shecht it, you need to flay it and chop it into its parts. What is that telling you? The Torah is teaching you a proper way of behaving. You should not eat meat before you've had a chance to flay it and to chop it up. You shouldn't be so ravenous that you, as soon as an animal is shechted, you're like, well, that's what I was going to ask. You stuff it in your mouth. Now, this seems to be simply saying just an issue about derech eretz. Don't be ravenous. Wait for us to flay and to chop it up and so on. But the Gemara is going to think that maybe he's even making a halachic point, not just a derech eretz point. So the Gemara says, "My kamash malad." What's the point of this? To reject the position of Rav Huna. Rav Huna says the following: an animal while it's alive, a walking around, living, breathing animal is forbidden, even a cow, because it's not shechted. Unless you know that it was shechted properly. Now, what's the point of saying this? It's not just saying you have to shecht an animal. It's saying if you have a doubt whether the shechita was done properly, you don't know if there was a nick in the knife, and whether the nick in the knife came before or after the shechita. He's telling you, well, it had a cheskes isser. Before it was shechted, it had a label of being asur. And you do not remove that status of cheskes isser unless you definitely know that it was shechted properly. So if it is a different isser, so Tosos creates an isser. Rashi says Eivrim Minachai. Tosos says that's a different isser than not shechting it properly, which is nevela. So Tosos says, okay, he creates this isser called Eino Zavuach, not shechted, which applies whether it's alive or dead. Based on the mitzvahs, he says it is an asay, v'zavachta v'achalta. Okay, so he says it has a status of asur, cheskes isur, and therefore any doubt about the shechita, it remains asur. You need to definitely know the shechita was done correctly. That's point number one. Nishchita. Now let's say you know the shechita was done correctly. The knife was perfect. You watched it. It was a perfectly executed shechita. Then the cheskes heter omedes. It has a presumption of being mutar. And now, and until you know for sure that there was a treifa, which means we assume animals are not a treifa, you shecht an animal that has a cheskes heter. And therefore, you do not have to now verify and that there are absolutely no treifas in the animal. You do not now have to check every single organ and make sure that there are no treifas. It has a cheskes heter, and any doubt is not a problem unless you know for certain that it actually is a treifa. So here it works the opposite. Any doubt is ignored unless you know for certain it is a treifa. Now, by the way, that's not exactly the halacha. The halacha distinguishes between two types of doubts: a mir hamatzoi and a mir she'eno matzoi. A mir she'eno matzoi is normally defined as, let's say, less than 5%, occurrence. We don't have to be concerned with it all. But once something happens 5% or more of the time, then the assumption is that if it's possible to check, we need to check. And that's why we check like the lungs, because problems in the lungs happen 5% or more of the time. So since it's available to us to check, we need to check. But let's say you lost the lungs. You shechted the cow, and somehow the cat made off with the lungs. The halacha would be mutter. It has a cheskes heter. So even if you've got some doubt, if you don't know, if it's possible to check, maybe you do check. But if it's not possible, it's mutter until you know for sure that it's asur. That's what Rav Huna says. We pass them that way. So maybe you're coming to reject Rav Huna. You're saying don't eat from it until you flay it and dismember it. Maybe the reason you're demanding flaying and dismembering is to give us a chance to do what? To say we have to check it for treifas before we're going to let you eat from it. So the Gemara says, our Mishnah supports Rav Huna that halachically it's allowed. Nan, Rabbi Akiva Omer, afil kezayis chaymi beis tvichasa. You can even have a raw kezayis of meat from the place it was shechted. So you see, you don't have to halachically wait to check for treifas. So the Gemara says, my love mi beis tvichasa mamish. Does it not literally mean from the place in the neck where it was shechted? Lo, mimakom shetovachat achilata. No, what it means is from the place where the food gets ground and gets digested, meaning from the stomach meat, which is very bizarre. Why would Rabbi Akiva say, as long as you can eat a kazayis of the stomach meat? So, because the Rashi says, because maybe that's like considered like easily digestible or something. I don't know. It's very bizarre. Something you would be prepared to eat raw. Like, I won't eat my meat raw unless we're talking about the organ meat. Then I'll eat raw. So Gemara says, Atani Rabbi Chia, but that's not true, because Rabbi Chia says, it has a bright, Makom Tvichasa Mamash, that literally Rabbi Akiva means the place where it was shechted, the neck meat. So anyway, you see that you do not halachically, nobody disagrees that you need to dismember it and check. We all agree you don't need to, you can eat from it before you've checked for treifos. So therefore, what is the point of saying that you need to flay it and dismember it? Ella Rami Bar Chama, not Rami Bar Chama, who was it? Rabbi Bar Abba, Orchat Ara Kamash Malam, like he said from the outset, he wasn't telling us halacha. You're right, halachically it's mutter even before you've checked it. He was just telling us basic derech eretz. Don't be so ravenous to tear from the meat before it's been flayed and dismembered. Kiritanya, like we taught in the Beitzah, do not eat a garlic or an onion from the top of it, meaning I guess we would call it the bottom of it, but rather from the place where the leaves grow out, from what we would call the top. Anyway, somehow if you eat from towards the root of it, that's like, oh my God, you're so ravenous, you can't even wait to eat it in a normal way. Again, I don't know exactly why that shows that you're ravenous, maybe because you don't even want to bother to have to pick the leaves. And if you eat that way, you're showing yourself to be ravenous. The whole point of bringing this in is to show that sometimes rabbinic literature addresses itself not to halachic questions, but just not to act in ways that are ravenous. And that was the point of the teaching of the raw meat as well. Similarly, don't drink up your entire glass in one gulp. presumably talking about wine. V'im shasa raise a gargaron, and if you did, then you are also like ravenous or a glutton or whatever the liquid equivalent is of a glutton.
What about kiddush?
What?
What about kiddush?
Oh, about the whole thing?
In one or not?
Well, they say you're supposed to have like a rove kose, but not the whole glass.
Once, like,
Right, not the whole thing.
Two separate things.
So yeah, sometimes you really like to say, "Oh my God, I didn't realize how dehydrated it is." Because once you start drinking, you go.
Chug your kids.
So anyway, Tana Rabbanan, our rabbis taught, Hashosa koser b'vasachas, if you drink it all down in one gulp, hareza gargaron, you're ravenous. Shnayim, in 2 sip gulps, derech eretz, that's like the normal way. Okay, shlosha, if you just so sip it so daintily and slowly, three separate drinks, igasi haruach, then you're being very haughty. All right, but so anyway, you see though that we bother teaching you about how to act in ways that are just civility, right? Rami bar Abba chatzuva v'kateya raglohen derishiyaya. So the chatzuva, which is basically a type of a grass that grows straight down, and it was used, the Gemara says by Yehoshua, to show the boundaries of the land, that you have this grass that grows straight and it clearly demarcates the boundaries, that cuts the legs out from under the wicked people. What does that mean? So Rashi says it's more symbolic. That you see there's this grass that goes straight and keeps exactly in its boundary, and if you're a type of person that's coveting and stealing land that's not yours, you should have learned a lesson from the grass. The Marsha says it's better than learning a lesson. What you're going to do is you want your neighbor's field, you mow down the grass, you stake a claim in his field and you say it's yours, and then when you start digging up the land underneath, you see the roots of this grass and of this weed, and that proves that you stole his land. So it undercuts your legs, because this grass basically undercuts his legs, shows that that this person was stealing. Nitia, nekatea raglo, now you'll see why we're mentioning this. Because of the next line. Netia mekatea ragleo dekatzvaya udebarle nidot. The plantings, which means the fact that you have to wait 3 years before you can eat from the fruit of a tree because of orla, so you invest all of this time and effort, and you need a lot of patience and self-restraint, and that's what the Torah tells you by orla. That should be a lesson for the butchers and for the boalei nidot. So the butchers are the people that, as we've been talking about, that will eat the meat before they've had a chance to check for treifa. Now, even though we just said technically you don't have to check for treifa, you can assume it's mutter, but nevertheless, the proper thing to do is, who wants to find out a week later that because you rushed to eat the meat and you didn't check, that winds up you ate treifa. So you know what? You should learn a certain amount of restraint and patience from the principle of orla, even if technically you're allowed to eat from the meat before you've flayed and dismembered and checked it. And similarly, certainly the case of boalei midot, then, they cannot wait to have sex with their wives before they've had a chance to go to the mikveh. They should learn a lesson from how much patience it takes in the case of orla. So sometimes you need a little patience before you can have some of the pleasures in life. Tormasa, so anyway, that was the time. Tormasa, mekatei reglei d'sanan Yisrael. Now, tormasa, which is a type of a bean that required cooking 7 times before it could be eaten, that undercuts the legs of the enemies of the Jews, which means the Jews. Shinemar, as the verse says, Vayosifu b'nei Yisrael lasot hara b'nei Hashem. They continue to evil in the eyes of God. Vayavdu et ha'be'alim. They worship the foreign gods. The et ha'ashtarot, count the number of different foreign gods. Be'alim 1, Ashtarot 2, et Elohei Aram 3, et Elohei Tzidon 4, et Elohei Moab 5, et Elohei Bnei Ammon 6, et Elohei Plishtim 7. Now, this tormasa requires 7 cookings before it could get ready, before it could be eaten. Et Hashem, vayazvu et Hashem v'lo avdu, and they abandoned God and didn't worship Him. Once it says they abandoned God, I don't know they didn't worship Him. What does it mean they didn't worship Him? I feel like in tormasa even like this bean, that you cook it 7 times, and you just eat it for a dessert. They didn't even treat me like this bean. Now, what does that mean? What's the idea? So Rashi indicates 2 different interpretations. Who's the bean here? So one is that the Jewish people are the bean, because for with every time that they worship the foreign gods, God punished them. So it's like they were punished 7 times because they worshiped 7 foreign gods, like the bean that was cooked 7 times, and the lousy bean, after being cooked 7 times, becomes edible. You get cooked 7 times and you still abandon God, and you get, suffering, you still abandon God. The other interpretation, it sounds though a little bit more like God is the bean, right? So what does that mean? So the Marsha says it means because the bean you eat as a dessert. And what God is saying is, You not only worship these other gods 7 times, you didn't even have me worship me together with the other gods. You completely abandoned me. Like, you didn't even have me for dessert, so that was the problem. Okay. Now, Tana Mishmei Rav Meir, Neiman Nitna Torah Yisrael. Since we're talking about worshiping other gods or whatever, anyway, somehow this is loosely connected. Why was the Torah given to the Jewish people? Maybe we want to say something nice about Israel rather than end on a negative note. Where were we? Because they are very hard and stubborn. So what does it mean? So Tana de Rabbi Shmuel, we know Eish Das Lamo, from God's right hand is a fiery law for his people. These people are so tough, they can handle this law of fire. Igadami, and some say that their whole way, the way of the people, is this fiery way. What does that mean? That you need the Torah to soften them up. They're so adamant and stiff-necked, basically, and hard, that if it weren't that the Torah was given to them, they would, be destructive towards the other nations. So they need the Torah to, to correct them a bit. So it seems like we're sort of trying to do is, on the one hand, saying okay, we sinned, but maybe I think what it's trying to say is that in a way, the fact that we're Am Kshay Oref has very negative consequences, but it has positive consequences because it means we're able to stick to our keeping we also stick to God and stick to the Torah when we're not abandoning God. Yes.
The Torah essentially tames
yes.
and controls the Jews, because otherwise the rest of humanity wouldn't be able to abide them.
Abide the Jews.
Yeah.
I thought it meant more they would have been destructive to the rest of humanity.
Yeah, they would have been destructive to them. Something
like that. Right. So anyway, also maybe it works on them like the tormis, they got to be cooked or something to be made edible. The height of them, Reb Shimon Lakish, Gimel Azimim, there are 3 that are very tough. Yisrael be'umat, Jews amongst the nations. Kelev b'chayot, the dog, you have to think more like wild dogs and wolves among the animals. Tarnagol ba'ofot, and by the way, the Maharsha points out it's not like the dog is the bravest of the animals or the strongest of the animals, but he's like the most tenacious.
Most annoying.
Yeah, well, maybe that. The chicken among birds, Rashi's not exactly sure what that is. The ram amongst domesticated animals. Daka. Amongst the small animals. The slough among trees, and Rashi doesn't exactly get what the point is of that. Okay, we will have to end here for now.
Slough is
what is
capers.
Capers, okay.